Hello and welcome everyone to the Polity Primer series of Drishti IAS. My name is Pragya, and in the previous episode we were discussing about the making of our Indian Constitution, or how our Indian Constitution was drafted by the Constituent Assembly. And in today's episode we are going to discuss the historical background of our Indian Constitution. In this discussion we will firstly study about the historical background of our Indian Constitution, and then we'll see a practice question for your prelims examination and a practice question for your mains examination. So if I talk about the historical background of our Indian Constitution, so various features of the Indian Constitution and polity have their roots in the British rule. We were governed by the Britishers for almost 200 years, and definitely they have shaped up the Indian Constitution and polity. There were certain events in the British rule that laid down the legal framework for the organization and functioning of the government and administration in the British India, and that led to the foundational stones of having our Indian Constitution. Okay. And these events have greatly influenced our Constitution and polity. So what were these acts, or what were these events that have influenced our Constitution and polity? Let us discuss them one by one. So firstly, there is this Regulating Act of 1773. It was an important piece of legislation, and it was the first step taken by the British government to control and regulate the affairs of East India Company in India. The second feature of this act was that it recognized for the first time the political and administrative functions of the company. So from traders, they suddenly started ruling India. They suddenly started to have their roots established in India, not only as traders but as the rulers of India, as the administrators of India. Okay, and it laid the foundations of central administration in India. And this is what I was explaining to you, that from traders they suddenly became administrators in India. And this Regulating Act of 1773 is also important because it established the Supreme Court in Calcutta. And at that time there was just one CJI plus 3 judges. Okay, so whenever there is a question in your examination that the Supreme Court was established through which act, you will mark the answer as Regulating Act of 1773. Okay, so moving forward, the second act is the Charter Act of 1853. Another important piece of legislation before the British Crown took over the administration from the British East India Company. So it separated for the first time the legislative and executive functions of the Governor General's Council. In fact, it established the Indian Central Administrative Council. So this Indian Central Administrative Council was established through this Charter Act of 1853. And this Indian Central Administrative Council gave local representation. It acted as a mini British Parliament in India. And it also introduced an open competition system of selection and recruitment of civil servants. And if you'll ask me, ma'am, what is the importance of this? So for the very first time, the civil services, the British civil services were thrown open for the Indians as well. So moving forward, let us discuss the another important act, that is known as the Indian Councils Act of 1909, also known as the Morley-Minto Reforms. Morley-Minto Reforms. Okay, so this is also known as the Morley-Minto Reforms, and it considerably increased the size of legislative councils, both central and at the provincial level. At that time, the states were known as the provinces. It also provided for the first time for the associations of Indians with the executive councils of the viceroys and the governors. And not only this, it was the first act which was talking about having separate electorates, separate electorates for the Muslim community. And what do we understand by this separate electorate for the Muslim community? That means the Muslim leaders will be selected by Muslim voters. So this led to the foundation of communalism in India. This modeled into reforms of or the Indian Council Act of 1909. Moving forward comes another important act, and that is known as the Government of India Act of 1919. Also known as the Montague-Chelmsford reform. Montague-Chelmsford reforms. So what were the features of this act? That it introduced for the first time the bicameralism and direct elections in the country. So for the very first time, it talked about having a bicameral houses of parliament. That means it divided the houses of parliament into an upper house and a legislative assembly. The upper house or the Council of States is also known as the Rajya Sabha in the present term, and this legislative assembly is known as the lower house of the parliament or the Lok Sabha. So bicameral houses of parliament were introduced by this act. Okay, and it also introduced diarchy. So what do we understand by this diarchy? Let us understand that firstly it divided the subjects into central subjects and provincial subjects. Provincial subjects. So it divided the subjects, like there were three lists as you know, that there were federal list, the provincial list, and the concurrent list. Okay, so the powers were divided between the central government and the provincial government by the way of these three lists known as the federal lists, provincial list and the concurrent list. So the subjects are also divided in the central and the provincial subjects, and that means on the central subjects, the central government had the power to make laws, and on the provincial subjects, the provincial government had the power to make laws. And these provincial subjects were further divided into transferred subjects and reserved subjects. So basically, what did it do? It introduced government at two levels, at the central level and the provincial level, by dividing clearly bifurcating the subjects, and the provincial subjects were further bifurcated as transferred and reserved. So this is known as the provision of diarchy, or having governments at two different levels. And this was introduced by the Government of India Act 1919. And it also provided for the establishment of a Public Service Commission. Most important provision for your examination, that through which act the Public Service Commissions were established. It is the Government of India Act of 1919, also known as the Montague-Chelmsford reforms. Then moving forward, let us discuss one of the most important acts that has shaped up our Indian Constitution today, and that is the Government of India Act of 1935. Firstly, it provided for the establishment of All India Federation consisting of provinces and princely state as units. So basically, it divided the provinces and princely states into autonomous administrative units. Autonomous administrative units. Okay, that means the British government gave them certain freedom in governing themselves. Okay. The act divided the powers between the center and the units in terms of three lists, as I have explained that there were three lists known as the federal list, provincial list and the concurrent list. It also abolished diarchy in the provinces and introduced provincial autonomy in its place. So instead of having governments at two level, the provinces could now act as an autonomous administrative units. They had certain degree of power in their hand. And not only this, it also for the very first time introduced the concept of budget. Okay, so this Government of India Act of 1935 is one of the most important pillars in formation of our Indian Constitution. Most of our provisions of our Indian Constitution is inspired from the Government of India Act of 1935. Moving forward, it also provided for the establishment of a Reserve Bank of India to control the currency and credit of the country. It also provided for the establishment of not only a Federal Public Service Commission, okay, but also a Provincial Public Service Commission and a Joint Public Service Commission for two or more provinces. And all of these provisions have been retained in the Indian Constitution. The Federal Public Service Commission is known as the UPSC. The Provincial Public Service Commission is known as the State Public Service Commissions. And the states can ask the President of India to constitute two or more joint public service commissions for them, and they are known as the Joint Public Service Commission for two or more provinces. So all of these important provisions of the Government of India Act have been retained in our Indian Constitution, and that is why this is the pillar from which our Indian Constitution has been inspired. Okay. It also provided for the establishment of a federal court, which was set up in the year 1937. So this federal court eventually became the Supreme Court of India. Then comes the most important act, and that is the Indian Independence Act of 1947, which was responsible for the partition of India. Okay, into India and Pakistan. India and Pakistan. So finally in 1947 what happened was the Mountbatten Plan was accepted and India was hence partitioned through this Indian Independence Act of 1947 into India and Pakistan. Okay, so it ended the British rule in India and declared India as an independent and sovereign state from August 15, 1947. It empowered the constituent assemblies of the two dominions to frame and adopt any constitution for their respective nations and to repeal any act of the British Parliament, including the Indian Independence Act itself. So this act is the basic act which led to the partition of India. It also talked about that the two dominions could have their own constitution and they could form their own constitution. It also stated that till a constitution is formed, they can use the Government of India Act for their administration and they could modify that act also as per their convenience. It also abolished the offices of Viceroy in India and the Secretary of State for the India. Okay, so this was a very important act, and all of these acts, all of these important regulations, legislations have shaped up our Indian Constitution as of now. So with this we come to a conclusion of our today's discussion. We have seen all of the important British legislations which have formed the historical background of our Indian Constitution. Now let us discuss a practice question. So the question is, which act was considered the final step towards centralization in the British India? Your options are: option A is Regulating Act of 1773, your option B is Pitt's India Act of 1784, your option C is Charter Act of 1833 and your option D is Charter Act of 1853. Kindly drop your answers in the comment box below. Now let us discuss a practice question for your mains examination. So the question is, what were the historical underpinnings of the Indian Constitution and how did they influence its evolution? So firstly, you will write what is the historical background of our Indian Constitution, what were the British act which formed the foundational stone of our Indian Constitution. You can start from Regulating Act, then you can mention the Charter Act of 1858, then you can move forward to the after Crown took over the British administration in India from the East India Company. So you can discuss all of the important legislations which I have discussed in my discussion today, and you can conclude holistically that yes, our Indian Constitution has been inspired from the British Acts, and it has significant, these historical underpinnings have significant impact on the formation of the Indian Constitution and its evolution. So yes, you can conclude holistically. I hope this session was insightful for you. If you have any feedback regarding this session, kindly drop it in the comment box below. If you liked today's video and found it to be helpful, kindly like the video and subscribe to our channel for more such updates. Thank you.